All right, I have here the 2021 book Fault Lines by Voddie Baucham. This is either an heroic argument or an incredibly infuriating one, depending on what side of the culture war argument you find yourself on. But what did I actually think of the book? What did I actually think of his argument and the substance of it? Let me tell you. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I'm going to follow my typical review format for this book, which is a recap of the main idea, some thoughts on the research, the readability, and then ending on the reasonableness. And I'm going to try to get to the reasonableness section first, because that's probably the part that's of the most interest, especially given the charged nature of kind of this whole topic that Baucham is trying to address here with the book. But without getting further into that, the main idea of Fault Lines here is he's taking on really the entire conversation as it relates to race, justice, American history, critical race theory, and postmodern philosophy and all that. He's kind of taking that whole thing on, and as the title of the book indicates, he is proposing a metaphor of a fault line, a geographic fault line in this case, as in fault lines that cause earthquakes. And he is proposing that there is a fault line under the surface of all these arguments. And it's really an indelible fault line. Like if you've crossed over the fault line, eventually an earthquake is going to hit. And depending on if you're on the right or wrong side of that fault line, you're going to be in the wreckage. At least if in the North American evangelical context. So I've been saying all this as neutrally as possible, but he makes no qualms about what side of things he is on. He is very, very, very against everything that what he labels critical social justice. Anything related to critical race theory or Marxism or postmodern philosophy, he is dead set against all that, and this book is an attempt to say that anyone who uses those concepts has crossed to the wrong side of the fault line in the kind of cultural battle that we're in. So hence the subtitle is The Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. This is a book written to and for Christians, people who call themselves evangelical. Okay, that's the main idea. It's a little hard to summarize because the book actually goes into a lot of directions. It goes into some personal memoir stuff. It goes into cultural criticism. It goes into political criticism. It goes into some theological criticism, but there's a lot in it. So it's kind of all over the place, but that's the main theme. So the research. I'm trying to hold back too much of my personal evaluation until the end, but it's going to come pretty clear pretty fast, and I'm pretty critical of this book. That being said, the research is frustrating. He does quote some primary sources as it relates to the critical race theory kind of field of literature, but it's pretty thin. I got to be honest, it's pretty thin. So he does quote people like Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw. He does quote some pieces by them, although he mostly limits himself to one text, an intro text to critical race theory, which is the Delgado book, and then one or two journal articles from Kimberly Crenshaw. He never quotes Derek Bell, which is surprising to me. He never actually directly cites any primary sources from any of the Frankfurt School thinkers, which is surprising because in the book he directly tries to confront the Frankfurt School. And then when he does summarize philosophical ideas or movements, his research, at least indicated in the footnotes, his research is mostly secondary summary level sources. So I'm going to say more about this in the thing in the reasonableness, but he frequently cites, intro textbooks, introductory textbooks to different ideas and fields, when he is summarizing things like, Marx's conflict theory as it relates to class. So it's honestly, I was not impressed with the level of research and kind of the rigor in the research in this book. And I looked over the footnotes. I tend to look at footnotes pretty carefully when I read, and I was pretty disappointed. He does do some direct quotations, and I think he doesn't want to misrepresent the thinkers that he is arguing against, but the research just wasn't very deep. The readability, this is probably, I don't know, quote unquote, the best part of the book, in my opinion. It's super, super readable. It's actually, even if you find the argument itself rankling or frustrating, the actual style is very breezy and very conversational, and it's a really quick read. And especially when he's telling his personal story, you can kind of get pulled into it. And he's actually a pretty enjoyable writer stylistically, very easy to read. So if you are worried about it being overly academic or unapproachable from that sense, it's not. Okay, try to get through that quickly. Reasonableness. I'm going to camp on this for a little bit, and this might be a little bit longer than my typical book review section on a book review because of what I see as the importance of kind of this whole conversation that Baucham is kind of wading into. So first, I want to say a few things about what I did appreciate and what I maybe broadly agree with. If you've watched other videos on my channel, particularly my series of videos through and my personal journey through the anti-racism kind of philosophy and movement, you'll know that I can be very critical of especially what I call popular critical race theory or popularized notions of critical race theory. People like Robin DiAngelo, who he also quotes in this book. I am actually broadly sympathetic to a lot of Baucham's concerns here. And I think in the sense that when he is trying to argue that there is something significant going on around this conversation within the evangelicalism, I actually agree with him that it is very significant and it is something we need to be very wary of and think very carefully about, and frankly probably should have some concern about. And so in the broad contours of his argument, I'm actually pretty sympathetic to his posture and to some of the critiques he levels. More specifically, there's one particular chapter in here, because I'm going to be quite critical of this, but I want to try to make clear that I did read it. I try to read it carefully, and I try to give as much benefit of the doubt as possible and find things that I can't agree with. There's one particular chapter in here that comments on, I forget the title of the chapter, I could probably pull it up really quickly in the book. It's the Seeking True Justice chapter, I believe. In that chapter, he takes on the problem of how narratives and stories are overtaking or eclipsing data and facts on the ground, particularly as it relates to the conversation about policing and race and racial justice in America. And so stories about victims of police violence and the narratives, how that feeds into American history as it relates to race, his point in that chapter is that the bigger stories we're telling are eclipsing actual facts on the ground about what's actually happening in any specific circumstance. I actually really liked that chapter. I thought it was actually pretty persuasive. I thought it was a really good summary of a lot of data. And I think it's probably the best kind of section of the book. And I wish, given that, his book and his argument had limited itself in scope a little bit more to things like that, like specific cultural issues and specific discussions of data and facts. I wish that he had stayed there because it would have been a more effective book. So that being said, I'm going to pivot now into my critiques. On the whole, and I'm just going to say it now, I'm just going to say it up front, I'm going to unpack what I mean. On the whole, this argument really fails, in my opinion. I think this book is not helpful and does not pose in the overall scope of the argument he's trying to make, it does not work. And part of that is because he's taking a major swing, and by that I mean he is trying to level a really deep philosophical, epistemological argument. He is trying to essentially say, and with the image of the fault line, he is trying to say, a big plank of his argument is that if you take on any aspect of what he terms critical social justice, if you take on any aspect of that, then you have de facto converted an entire paradigm worldview. You cannot take any aspect of critical social justice and without converting holistically into a total different worldview. It's almost metaphysical in that sense. That's his argument. And so that's the fault line. He's saying there is a fault line, and if you take any piece of critical social justice, you have crossed the fault line. That's his argument, and it's more of an assertion than a demonstrated argument. He is asserting it without demonstrating how does that work philosophically. If you're going to say that the entire paradigm is a whole you can't take a piece of it without converting completely, then how exactly does that work, and what does that look like? Rather than demonstrating that rigorously, he simply cherry picks quotes from Christian leaders that he uses as kind of almost prima facie examples of his own argument. So he will quote people like Tim Keller and Matt Chandler and David Platt, who are remarkably conservative Christian leaders. And he'll pull out quotes from them when David Platt, for example, mentions his own white privilege in a sermon. Baucham will pull that quote out and say, see, this is an evidence that this leader has crossed the fault line, and therefore the implication is you cannot trust their teaching because they have adopted this entirely new worldview paradigm that is completely incompatible with what he would say is a, quote, biblical or orthodox or Christian worldview. The problem is, again, he's asserting it without demonstrating it and without rigorously unpacking how exactly that that crossing of that fault line works philosophically. And the problem is, here's the problem. That's a deep philosophical argument, and the philosophy he's bringing to this argument in this book is just not up to the task to backing up that claim. And this is it's very clear by the fact that in the opening pages, any actual discussion of the ideas at play in this conversation, ideas like Marx. Oh, and it's super frustrating. He throws the term Marx and cultural Marxism around, and it rankled me a lot because it felt like he wasn't actually talking about Marx's actual philosophy, but actually popularized notions of it. And it's very clear because in the opening pages of the book, he relegates, for example, an entire summary of Marxian conflict theory, which is one layer of kind of what Marx was doing with his read of history and philosophy, which is the notion of conflict between class groups. The entire discussion of that idea is relegated to 2 sentences in the opening pages of the book, and the footnote there, this gets back to something I was saying earlier about the research, the footnote for that summary points to an open source intro to sociology textbook that I'd never heard of until I found the footnote and looked it up and tried to figure out who was the source. And that just demonstrates that the acumen and the rigor that he kind of has brought to this argument is just not very sharp. In terms of actually understanding what Marx was trying to do with his philosophy. Disagree with Marx all you want, and I have a whole video about why I disagree with Marx's philosophy ultimately. Disagree with it all you want, but if you're going to make an argument at that level, you got to demonstrate that you understand it so that you can then critique it from a deep place of understanding and pointing out what's wrong with it. Not a really, really paper-thin summary, and then launching into these diatribes that are cherry-picked quotes of leaders that then you've in turn kind of cycled back through your hermetically sealed argument that they therefore demonstrate that they have crossed this fault line that you're saying is inarguable and kind of non-negotiable in our culture. It's a non-falsifiable argument from his perspective, and anything that's non-falsifiable is just an assertion. It's not an actual good faith dialogue argument. Super, super frustrating. There's no discussion. Hegel is never mentioned. So if you're I'm not saying everyone needs to be an expert on Hegel to have these conversations, but if you're going to take on Marx at any level of depth, then you got to understand Hegel's influence on Marx, for example. Or better yet, Feuerbach's influence on Marx, because that's why Marx was an atheist materialist. And Marx's atheism materialism feeds into a big reason why he leveled such a critique on social structures, because if you're a materialist, then social structures are all you have to fix the world. None of this stuff is talked about in Baucham's book. And again, that wouldn't be a frustration to me if he wasn't trying to take it on and point back to those thinkers. He summarizes the entire Frankfurt School in about 3 or 4 sentences. And again, never directly quotes people like Adorno or Marcuse, at least. So Carl Trueman, a book I have behind me that I've also reviewed, Carl Trueman is probably, in a broad strokes, very sympathetic to where Baucham is coming from here. But when he discusses people like Marcuse, you can tell he has actually read it and internalized and understands the ideas that he's critiquing. Not so with fault lines. All right, I'm going to bring this too close. I'm starting to. The more I talk about this, the more frustrated and passionate I get. So I'm going to try to wrap this up because I want to keep this video relatively short. But what I want to say is, and it's all the more frustrating because I'm broadly sympathetic to some of the critiques that Baucham wants to make. And again, I do think that he has his finger on something that is significant. We just need better arguments to get into the conversation to deal with it. And what I want to say here, and why I'm ultimately very kind of against this book, is because it is contributing to the problem rather than working to unwind it or solve it. So in a weird, ironic twist, I would actually say that the fault line is not where Baucham thinks it is. I actually would say that the fault line, as it relates to this particular conversation, see if I can articulate this clearly. The fault line is the idea that you cannot learn from the critical theory school or critical race theory or any of the Frankfurt thinkers. The fault line, as he proposes it, is that you cannot learn from any of those thinkers without taking on a wholly non-negotiable worldview paradigm. That's the actual fault line. And he is proposing that fault line and laying it on the ground and kind of declaring it as a gauntlet. So the fault line, if a fault line exists, I would say it actually exists because of arguments like what Baucham is making. And it doesn't need to be there. So someone like a Tim Keller, who is by all accounts extremely conservative and extremely thoughtful, even if you disagree with him on some things, if someone like Tim Keller cannot thoughtfully articulate how a certain racial identification, in this case white, has afforded him certain cultural privileges that not everyone has had access to in our context. If you can't even articulate that with a nuanced and thoughtful way without crossing some Rubicon in Baucham's view, then the fault line that exists is only there because Baucham is saying it's there, or people like him. It only is there because they're saying it's there. And that is why I am so against these types of arguments, because that sort of entrenched argumentative notion is, in my opinion, driving more of the divisions that don't need to be driven. It's reifying these divisions in these camps in our society and our culture, and particularly in the evangelical world, of which I am a part. It's driving us into our camps, and it's making the divisions actually worse. It is not contributing to repairing the breach, to use a biblical allusion. It's actually, I would honestly forcefully say it is making things worse, more so than it is helping. And so it's deeply grievous to me. It's deeply frustrating. And I would encourage anyone to read the book to really understand kind of where someone like Baucham is coming from, and maybe sift and sort like some of the things that I think are of value, some of his critiques and pushbacks on some of the cultural things that are happening around narratives and data are valuable and helpful. But all told, don't wade into a deep philosophical cultural criticism if you're not equipped philosophically and epistemologically to actually do that work. Someone like a Carl Trueman, who's also a very conservative thinker, I would say is equipped to do that, and therefore a little bit more of much more of a trustworthy guide than what Baucham brings to fault lines. So this is a little bit of a longer review than what I typically do, but I found this book really, really frustrating, and I wanted to give some thoughts out of this because I know some people who, especially people who watch my videos and are interested in the conversation about race and critical race theory, are interested in understanding how to think about thinkers like Voddie Baucham. So those are my thoughts on fault lines. If you read it and if you have a different take, let me know. If you know of other books that make similar arguments, but maybe with a little bit more rigor and thought and depth, I would also love to know about that. And if there's other books like this that you'd love for me to give some of my thoughts on, also let me know. But as always, thank you for watching. Hope that you found something intellectually interesting or stimulating or thought-provoking here.